which sits ancestral and unceded territory of the Han Communum-speaking Musqueam people. This land has been taken care of for millennia and still holds so many treasures that we get to enjoy. We get to learn, teach, create knowledge in very privileged conditions. Today, it's a particularly exciting seminar for me because I get to introduce Sam. So Sam is creating a strong precedent. She's the first ever member of the Environmental Economics and Ecology Lab, PI included, to present in the seminar. She's also part of the Working to Restore Connectivity and Sustainability Lab led by Claire Kremen. So she also follows in the footsteps of brilliant students and PI. Sam is from Ontario. She comes from a household that's very animal rich and includes most recently baby pigeons that I'd love to meet. She received her Bachelor of Science from the University of McGill and is now completing her master's in IRES. One word that I will use to describe Sam is, well, I couldn't choose between presence and engagement. I think I'll use them as synonyms, but she's very engaged in her research, engaged in her teaching, engaged in our live dynamics, and engaged in the social life of IRES as well as the co-president of the student society. So I hope that you're all as excited as I am. Please join me in welcoming Sam today.
Okay. Thank you, Josephine, for such a wonderful introduction and for doing our land acknowledgement as well. It is so nice to see you all here today. Before we begin, I do want to also take a moment to acknowledge the fact that my research is taking place across Southern Ontario, which is the traditional territory of many peoples, including the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. This is the land that I grew up on, and I'm very grateful to have lived there. And I recognize that I still have much learning to do about both the historical and contemporary context of these lands. I hope that the work that I'm presenting today and that I'm continuing to work on is in some way able to complement the ongoing care and stewardship that has been undertaken by these nations. So today I'm very excited. I'm going to be talking about my thesis research titled Simulating the Impacts of Hedgerow Restoration on Population Capacity in Southern Ontario. We're going to talk about what all those words mean, if it's a little bit of a wordy title. Okay, I don't know how to advance. I can just use the little thingy. Oh, that was very obvious. Thank you, Kate. Okay, so getting right into it, this is a statistic that I'm sure you are all quite familiar with, but currently 44% of the habitable surface of the Earth has been converted for agriculture. And the land use conversion for agriculture results directly in habitat loss and degradation. And it is commonly accepted that habitat loss is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And the IUCN estimates that habitat loss and degradation is the main threat to approximately 85% of all species on the IUCN Red List. Agricultural expansion can subset what was once a large intermixing populations into smaller spatially distinct populations shown in this diagram. These smaller sets of populations are often what we refer to as a metapopulation, where they're a set of smaller populations. Agricultural expansion can not only result in loss and degradation of habitat, but also has really impactful consequences on how species move. And this is kind of the theme of the talk and really what I'm interested in. The agricultural landscape is not always very conducive to movement, as you might be able to imagine, and this matters for animals to be able to find food, mates, spawning and nesting habitat, as well as for migratory movements that might be seasonal or life stage dependent. The inability to move between habitat fragments threatens the ultimate persistence of populations because they're less successful at meeting their own individual needs, but it also has broad-scale implications for the longevity of that metapopulation or set of populations, as populations must be able to mix with other populations to enable the process of gene flow, as well as to colonize new patches in the case of stochastic events to prevent local extinctions. So I'm going to spend a couple points here on some definitions just to give you a bit more background on what we're talking about. When we talk about ecological connectivity, we're referring to the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. So achieving ecological connectivity kind of is getting at meeting this unimpeded flow, allowing species to move around freely. But when we measure connectivity, we're often talking about the degree to which a landscape is able to support species movement. So how well a species can move within a landscape, which means that when we evaluate connectivity, we evaluate a landscape based on a species ecology. There are countless ways to measure connectivity. So many metrics exist, but one way is metapopulation capacity, which is particularly used in fragmented landscapes to predict if a metapopulation or that set of populations will long-term be able to persist. So metapopulation persistence is inherently linked to species survival because we obviously need metapopulations persist for species to survive, but we can also use it to predict if species will survive long-term. So one way that we can improve connectivity is the addition of stepping stones in the landscape, which enable movement in a landscape that would otherwise be considered impervious. This is well understood in the landscape ecology literature, and the value of small patches has been kind of increasingly recognized and implemented in conservation in recent history. In agricultural landscapes where it's especially difficult to conserve or restore large expanses of land due to the constraints presented by the sprawl of agriculture, small stepping stones are one way that we can mitigate the challenges that agriculture presents to movement. So adding stepping stones in a landscape can create movement pathways in a landscape that would otherwise be too difficult to cross. So now zooming into the context of where my project is actually based, we're looking at Southern Ontario. For those of you a little less familiar with your Canadian geography, there's a bit of a graphic in the corner for you. But this is the Mixedwood Plains ecozone of Ontario, which is across the whole southern region of the province. It's a bit more temperate than the rest of Ontario. And as you can see from the purple-ish color, the agricultural sprawl is very extensive. All of that purple is cropland in Ontario. This is primarily grain like soy, wheat, and corn. But it's very widespread across Ontario. But not only is this region responsible for large amounts of agricultural production, it's also home to one of Canada's largest biodiversity hotspots, right in the southern region referred to as the Carolinian Zone. But the incredible sprawl of agriculture has absolutely taken its toll on wildlife and the amount of habitat available in the region. Assessments done by Agriculture Canada for approximately 500 terrestrial species determine that there are currently low, generally, amounts of habitat available for feeding and even less for reproduction. This is kind of a startling figure and is pretty scary to look at, especially when you consider the fact that we have so much vast biodiversity just contained within the southern region of the province, which contains species that are not found anywhere else in Canada. So it is rather clear that there kind of needs to be some sort of conservation intervention to provide habitat in southern Ontario. However, when we consider stepping stone opportunities within the province, which we know are beneficial and can improve connectivity, we must consider the fact that we are heavily constrained within the agricultural matrix. So one of the main options that we consider actually occurs within agriculture, and that would be the use of field margins, which can be converted into natural habitat. Field margins are traditionally less productive than field interiors, and so kind of are an idealized habitat to potentially restore, especially work from the Canadian Wildlife Federation as well as ECCC have identified that field margins are one of the ideal areas for restoration in the province moving forward. So what restoration would look like is it would involve the planting of diverse sets of native plants, including some composition of trees, shrubs, and other herbaceous vegetation, which we call hedgerows. That is kind of the main vegetation you see in that picture, that row of hedge that divides two fields. And hedgerows are known to provide a myriad of benefits, like reducing nutrient loss, acting as windbreaks to prevent soil erosion, improving water infiltration capacity in soil, as well as harboring the natural enemies of agricultural pests and increasing pollinator habitat. But critically and specifically relevant to this project, hedgerows also serve as habitat for many more species than just insects and act as vital stepping stones for connectivity within the agricultural landscape. So moving on to kind of the general theme of what my research is about is we're looking at what the potential is of stepping stones in Ontario to improve metapopulation capacity. Based on what we know about species dispersal behaviors, we can do simulations to try and quantify this. My research is broken into 3 research questions, which I'm going to go through, as well as how we're answering each one, and then I'll take you a little bit into some preliminary results. So my first question is, how does hedgerow restoration improve connectivity across Southern Ontario, and at what points do benefits plateau? Essentially, we want to figure out how much benefit to connectivity we can get from hedgerow restoration and see if maybe there's some ideal amount of hedgerows we can add into the landscape, at which points we might see the values of that metapopulation capacity kind of plateau out. So to do this, we are testing different restoration scenarios that change the amount of hedgerows in the landscape. And we're varying the amount of hedgerows added, again, along primarily grain fields, since this is the majority of the agriculture, things like soy, corn, and wheat. And we're doing these in different densities. So this is a little bit of a grainy figure, but any finer resolution, and you'd kind of be too zoomed in. So on the left, we have kind of what the baseline of the landscape looks like. And then as we continue to simulate adding hedgerows into the landscape, whether that's adding hedgerows along 10% of grain fields or 100% of grain fields, that landscape is going to look different. Those little squiggles in neon green are what we would deem a hedgerow. And in our specific scenarios, the hedgerows we are simulating are just slightly under half a hectare. They're 15 meters by 300 meters. And so different scenarios that we're testing means adding different amounts of area into the landscape. A 1% scenario would be adding about 270 hectares across the whole region, 10%, 2,700 hectares, etc. And then what we're doing is with these different landscapes, comparing the change in that metapopulation capacity metric as we increase the amount of area of hedgerow added. My second research question is, instead of looking more at amount, we're thinking where are hedgerows most effective for improving connectivity and in what patterns? So we're testing different restoration scenarios that change the configuration of a fixed amount of hedgerows. So no varying on the area, but we're varying the locations. And there are 3 different ways that we're testing this configuration. The first is looking at evenness. So trying to add hedgerows in areas that contain less natural land to see if evening out the landscape is going to benefit metapopulation capacity in perhaps a different way than just kind of random additions. The second would be targeting hedgerows in areas that have been identified as conservation priorities by Parks Canada. These specific corridors have been identified as particularly important areas to improve connectivity. So focusing hedgerows here and seeing how that impacts metapopulation capacity. And the third way is we would be focusing hedgerows in areas that already have programs for farmer incentives. So in this case, we would be looking at where ALICE, or Alternative Land Use Services, is active, which is a non-government organization that has been a big proponent of hedgerows and sustainable agricultural practices in the province. And they do have a funding program available to provide farmer incentives, since hedgerows are created on private land. So this is a little bit more of a practical scenario where we might see more hedgerows crop up within the near future. And so we're testing the configuration of that as well. And then my third research question is asking, how do recommendations for restoration projects change across a set of species with varying dispersal capacities? I've told you that Southern Ontario contains such a wide variety of biodiversity, so it's obvious that we're accounting for this in the project. So to do this, we selected 5 focal species that represent a broad diversity of movement behaviors within the province. You can see the order of magnitude at which these individuals move, but we're modeling things that move on the tens of meters on a daily rate to over 100 kilometers in their natal dispersal. These species not only exemplify a diversity of dispersal behaviors, but they also use different habitat types, some preferring forest, some grassland, and some wetland, indicating that we'll be able to test where hedgerows are most effective for species that use all kinds of different habitat. But all 5 do benefit from hedgerow implementation and are known to use hedgerows as corridors. Also, importantly, all 5, except for the white-tailed deer, of course, are at risk to some degree, whereas the white-tailed deer is a pest species to farmers. So we're focusing mostly on species at risk, but we also want to be able to provide information about how farmer interactions with white-tailed deer might change. So using 5 different species with dispersal capacities allows us to make impactful recommendations that will try and include the various biodiversity that exists across the southern region of the province. I'm going to talk about some preliminary results in a second, and for those we are focusing specifically on 2 species, which I just want to highlight. The American badger, which generally moves between 10 and 100 kilometers, and the gray rat snake, which moves between 100 meters and a couple kilometers in its lifetime. I'm going to give just kind of a brief overview and a little bit more detail about the methods, and then I'm going to move into my preliminary results. So the process of what this actually looks like to do is selecting habitat and simulating hedgerow restoration using GIS. And by selecting habitat, I mean determining what habitat types are suitable for each species. Thank you. And we also simulate the restoration of hedgerows in GIS by converting our data. We can then take this species-specific habitat network where we know which habitat patches a species might be interacting with, and then calculate metapopulation capacity using species-specific dispersal information. We then use our metric to compare and rank these landscapes based on their predicted ability to sustain the movements of populations. And critically, the metapopulation capacity metric also provides patch-level information about the contribution of each patch to the overall system, which we can use to identify where critical hedgerows are in the landscape. So I'm going to show you some preliminary results which were done at the county level while we kind of figured out our methods. So what this figure is showing you is this is for the American badger. On the left is its home range, and on the right is its maximum dispersal range. And this is showing you all the locations of hedgerows within one county in Ontario. And the darker colors are where hedgerows are more critical to the movement pathways of the American badger. So on the left at its home range, which is a smaller range, the movements are more constrained within a corner, which is indicating that the badger is interacting with particular habitat patches within that region of the county. However, at the maximum dispersal range, we don't really see a pattern appear, and this is because the maximum dispersal range is so large that we just won't see really a pattern consolidate until we scale up to look at the whole region. We can also see that adding hedgerows made quite a difference in the overall metapopulation capacity metric, likely by providing new opportunities for movement. However, different results come up when we look at our preliminary findings for the gray rat snake. We see a different pattern appear. Again, this is likely because the gray rat snake is interacting with different habitat types than the American badger, so where is important for it will look different. And the clustering size also speaks to the lower dispersal capacity of the species. We also see a much smaller change in the metapopulation capacity metric, potentially because we would need to add significantly more hedgerows in the landscape to see a substantial increase. So moving on to the types of results that we're hoping to get now that I'm scaling up my analysis. To answer our first question, we would be looking at how metapopulation capacity responds as we increase the area of hedgerow added. And we would expect to see longer ranging species plateau first because smaller ranging species obviously can't move as far, so more and more unique pathways will be open for them as we increase the area of hedgerow added. The question mark is kind of because we don't know if we will reach a plateau, if there is some kind of idealized amount of hedgerows, at which point we don't really see any more returns from continuing to add hedgerows. So that is kind of a big question that we're trying to answer. And the second kind of piece of results that we're hoping to get is we want to compile all that data about hedgerow importance for each species across the region, sort of as a heat map, to get a sense if there are particular areas that are valuable across our diverse set of species. So this is an example with just the 2 species I showed you, but we would compile this information across all of our species in order to be able to make recommendations that have cross-species benefits. So moving on to our next steps. Right now, I'm working on results at the larger ecozone scale. As you could possibly imagine, scaling up to the entire region of Southern Ontario is rather computationally intensive. So that has been a little bit of a barrier, but I think we've worked through it. And so I'm very excited to be scaling up and being able to draw conclusions at the broader scale. And in terms of the implications that I hope my research has, we're obviously focusing on increasing connectivity, as well as providing much needed habitat within the region, trying to be strategic about where we add habitat to bolster connectivity while also providing the much needed habitat, especially with an emphasis on species at risk in the province. There are many species at risk. Our focal species are just a small sample of them, but they do encompass the needs of a variety of species at risk. So we're hoping that this has applications that can help benefit those species that are particularly being threatened by agricultural expansion. This also serves as a methodological tool that could be applied in other landscapes. By switching the species, you could use a similar method to identify where hedgerow restoration might be beneficial in other intensive agriculture systems. Could be applied in BC. You'd really just have to tailor the species, but simulating that restoration and running that same connectivity analysis could be applied in other contexts. And finally, a little piece of this that I hope kind of moves forward is that it will hopefully help advocate for more funding for sustainable agriculture initiatives. There's not a ton of available funding within the province. And so another analysis kind of suggesting, hey, we really need more funding for hedgerow restoration will hopefully provide more benefits and allow for more financial incentives. Because as I said, this does occur on private land. So there's often a financial incentive involved for farmers for them to convert their land into hedgerows. And I believe that that is my talk. Thank you all very much for listening. And thank you to the many members of my lab who have helped out throughout this journey, as well as to our collaborators at Canadian Wildlife Federation and to our funding partners. Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
All sort of vegetation, different tree species put together, they were all treated the same. Was there any sort of consideration of predation risk within the hedgerow? Because I know some predators can use that as an ambush for the species moving through.
Right. Okay. So yes, it's kind of two questions. First one is about the assumptions that kind of go into deciding what is a hedgerow? Is that kind of what you're asking, or?
What are all hedgerows treated the same?
Yes. So yeah, about the hedgerow composition and how they're kind of designated as hedgerows. So we kind of are assuming the composition is the same. Under our land cover data is two data sets that are merged together. So we have really specific data on crops. The hedgerow data is identified via satellite, so it's not perfect, and we're working at a 15-meter resolution, so I'm sure there's absolutely detail that's being lost because some hedgerows are a little bit finer than that. But yeah, it's a little bit difficult. Hopefully, the other classifications of land kind of help cover that if something was accidentally mislabeled as another habitat type. But if that species uses that habitat type, then it's still being included. So hopefully some of that risk is eliminated, but it's not perfect land cover data, and that's definitely kind of an assumption that we're making. And then the second question is there a predation risk in hedgerows because it can be used by ambush predators? That's a good question. There definitely is, in some cases, a predation risk. I mean, it's natural areas, and especially if species are kind of competing more and more for natural areas or being forced to interact a lot more because there's less natural habitat, then there's definitely a predation risk inherently. That is a great question, and I think that would be worth looking into a bit more, but ultimately we're really focusing on improving connectivity, and what happens within those hedgerows is going to happen in the landscape, whether or not there's, you know, improved connectivity. Honestly, improving the flow of movement might release some of those really competitive interactions because they would be able to escape habitat patches more easily. Yeah, great questions. Thank you. Hey, yeah.
Asking how important do you think hedgerow quality is versus, for example, vegetation composition in?
Yeah, so I guess do I need to repeat the question to Zoom? Okay. I wasn't sure. Okay. So the question is about what's the importance of hedgerow kind of quality versus extent. Yeah, I mean, again, with our assumptions, when we're talking about hedgerows, we're kind of all assuming that they're the same quality. And that can be said for a lot of this analysis, is that we're assuming kind of either good quality or bad quality. And there's a lot of finer scale detail that goes into landscapes than that. Hedgerow, yeah. Sorry, I just need a minute to think about it. I think the importance of the extent is really valuable for connectivity, because even a poorer quality hedgerow is going to be more beneficial to movement than a field that is really like intensively farmed. So even kind of scrubby little vegetation is still going to ultimately be more beneficial. So improving extent, even if the hedgerow is kind of newly growing or maybe not, you know, being taken care of in the best way, is still going to ultimately be beneficial. But what I'm hoping to include in kind of the discussion part of my project is also, you know, research on kind of what composition would be most beneficial, especially for the species that we're considering. So that, you know, in not only addressing the extent, we can also talk a little bit about the quality, but that's something as well that a lot of these NGOs that are involved in hedgerow restoration, they've worked really extensively on figuring out like an ideal composition, but they do tend to be very beneficial to pollinators and maybe a little less structural for larger animals. So that's something that I would definitely like to talk about further. Oh, everywhere. Okay, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sam. Question about what data were required for each of your species. Like, I know you had to get some ideas on the range and stuff, and your species selection, was it limited by like lacking data for certain species?
Yeah, so what was the process like for collecting kind of the dispersal data, and also how did the process go for determining which species to use? I'll talk a little bit about deciding what species to use first, and then I'll get into the dispersal data. So deciding what species to use really came down to, I started looking at what species were at risk, because that was kind of what I was interested in and what I wanted to start by focusing on. But then obviously you're limited by what species actually use hedgerows. Not all species do, and so it's kind of a moot point if they're not using hedgerows. So then it became a bit of a smaller list, and then at that point it was figuring out kind of what habitat types they were using and how far they dispersed, and there were some that were maybe a bit similar. So then it was kind of picking between the two of them. In terms of what data exists for their movement, there is unfortunately not a lot. A lot of these species are not super well characterized, and so what we're working with data-wise is more static dispersal distances versus like collared movement data, just because that does not exist for these species. So it's instead parameterized with just a distance that it's able to go, and depending on the movement behavior that it's engaging in, whether it's a daily movement or a more rare lifetime event, the function that describes kind of the pattern of movement looks a little bit different. But that's pretty much the data that we're working with, and sometimes that data comes from, you know, for the eastern meadowlark, dispersal distance that was found in probably Illinois, and that's kind of the only time anyone's ever found that data. So it's not perfect, but it gives us a better idea of how species move that we just don't go on. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Sherry, did you?
Yeah, I'm interested in that when part of your question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We talked on that. In one case, the rise and plateau was pretty flat, and the other
yeah, so that is just kind of a hypothetical result of what we might be expecting to see. based on previous research that I've done, there was in some cases a point where things plateaued. This was not done for hedgerows specifically, but for adding protected areas in a similar manner. But because hedgerows are small, we're not sure if it's going to plateau because so point of plateau would be far beyond what would even be feasible or possible to add hedgerows. But yeah, that's kind of in some of the longer ranging species we might see it, but in you know, woodland vole goes a maximum of I think 400 meters in its whole life. I don't know that we're going to get there on that one, but we'll have to see. I have a question.
Thank you. Were you able to account for the different variables of the rural landscape? So, hayfield might vary from say either within the year as well as
So were we able to account for the different permeability of agricultural classes is the question. So we did use the ACI data, so we have really specific data of what kind of field each thing was. But then the decision making for habitat pretty much came out to it gets a 1 if it's good habitat and it gets a 0 if it's not. But based on kind of intensive literature review, we were able to make some of those decisions based on where the species had been seen. So sometimes, you know, pasture land is good, but, you know, intensively farmed agriculture, not so much. Or some of the species use orchards, so that's differentiated. So it's not, you know, all things that are farmed is excluded. And then we've also kind of created several versions of those decisions to do a bit of a sensitivity analysis. So one that's really conservative, saying only the best habitat it's going to use, one that's, you know, a little bit more flexible, and one that's quite generalist to see if including maybe some of the lower quality habitat, but that it might still use has a big impact on it. So we're trying to capture that variability. In terms of within a year, that's not captured, but between land cover classes, we're trying to figure that out.
Well, I love these bang two presentations in one seminar type. And kudos to whoever organized one because the two talks actually flow together. And I'm excited to introduce Verena Rossa-Roccor, who's a PhD student. Unusually, I can introduce Verena as Dr. Rossa-Roccor because she's actually already a practicing psychiatrist, worked in Switzerland for a few years, came to be, did a master's and very near completing her PhD. And, you know, the Canadian Institute of Scholar is a UBC public scholar, has a bunch of terrific publications, and really has been a joy to co-supervise with Paul Kershaw. So I'm going to turn it over to Verena because time is short and we're all hearing your talk. And the connection is that Sam's talking about the importance of hedgerow restoration, which is all about how we can empower activists and scientists to take their research and actually turn it into effective policy change, creating agents of change, which Verena already is.
Not so sure. Thank you. Thank you, David, for the kind words. I can only disappoint after that. The entire time I was trying to come up with a really smart question for Sam that would link our talks. And the only thing I could come up with was, when do you think they're going to rename the American badger to Canadian badger? And I say that all jokes aside. Okay, I have the same problem. Oh, just with a mouse. Okay. Because I think I'm probably not the only one who's being kept up at night by the current political events. And I'm not the only academic, I'm sure. And there's more and more academics who are leaning into the role of being an advocate and an activist, trying to
create some change in this craziness, and not just since it's gotten so crazy. I mean, this is something that as academics we have thought about for a long time. So I just want to make this very clear from the get-go. My work is very intentionally meant for an audience of academics who believe they should act as knowledge mobilizers in whatever capacity. And I know there's a very valid and lively discussion out there on whether or not we should be doing this. But I think in the end, and this is sort of confirmed through my research, it's a personal choice whether or not you want to do this or not. And so in my work, I'm not further engaging in this discussion, but I'm moving on to a more pragmatic question of how can academics actually influence climate policy more effectively? And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on 3 themes that sort of came out of my work. One is, what does the literature encourage us to do? Is there any evidence out there on effective change-making strategies? And then comparing that to what my study participants told me what they were doing, and sort of assessing, are there any gaps in their strategic capacity? And if so, why do these gaps persist? And then also for this particular audience, I wanted to highlight, of course, some of the risks, but also benefits that my study participants reported. So let's do a very quick dive into the science of policymaking and policy changing. Very broadly, I sort of looked at 2 different bodies of literature. The one is the conventional knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization work. And then I also moved into political sciences, social movement scholarship, and also some
sound or everything
approaches, frameworks from moral psychology and marketing. And before I move further into what I found there, I thought it was important to really define these terms, strategy, tactics, and tools.
Hello.
They're often used interchangeably in this discourse. They're sometimes used interchangeably in the literature. But the way I understand it and
So
the
where
way
did it go?
Other scholars use them is strategy is sort of an overarching approach. Tactics are the ways in which the strategy is implemented.
Is it still on?
And tools are what is used to get it done. So what does that mean? As an example, let's say your strategy would be to build political counterpower to industry influence, whatever issue or topic. Then your tactic could be to organize a grassroots movement. And the tools you're using to do that would be relationship building, social media presence, creating policy briefs, etc. So back to the insights from the literature. I created this sort of conceptual framework based on what I found there. And you can see in the bubbles what I call an archetype of a knowledge mobilizer. So you have the advisor, the advocate, the insider, and the activist. And those are sort of ordered along 2 axes that are to be seen as a spectrum, not like a hard category either or. But the horizontal line represents, where's your audience? Is it inside the policymaking community or is it outside of the community? And then the vertical line is sort of your overarching strategic attitude almost, or a strategic approach. So are you a quote unquote truth teller or are you a power navigator? And so if I wanted to summarize the insights from the knowledge mobilization literature in 1 sentence, I would do it this way. I would say the advice is to conduct high quality, relevant research, summarize and communicate it well to your audience with whom you need to build relationships. And I think that is, there's no surprise there. Like, that is very intuitive for academics. Like, we would stand behind that, right? This is what we do on a daily basis. And this literature really sort of lives up here under the truth teller umbrella. There's one problem. Very often it's not very effective. It is effective in certain contexts, usually with very technocratic incremental policy change, but sort of the so-called super wicked problems that are out there in the world of policy and politics, this sort of strategy often falls short. And so I was interested in, okay, if that doesn't work, what does work? And so that's when I moved into the political sciences literature. And you can see I found 2 quotes out of this literature that really sort of encapsulate the thinking there. And so one would be sort of a different theory of change. The path from evidence to policy is mediated by politics and power. And if you want to be effective in that world, you actually have to turn what you have into what you need, which is power, to achieve what you want. And so this literature would live in the bottom 2 quadrants of my framework. And, there's some evidence that these tactics are much more promising in their efficacy, but we'll talk a bit more about what that means in a little bit. For now, I wanted to share with you 2 quotes from my participants that sort of highlight what I mean by truth teller, what I mean by power navigator. So the first one from a truth teller would be, when I was a research scientist, there's sort of that role you play. You walk into the room, you've got your scientist's hat. I'm just going to give you all the information and you can do what with it as you please. And then compare that to a power navigator who says, to me, the real political and social change is all about organizing. It's not about the ideas. The core for me of political and social change, that's where it comes from. The organizing that leads to a building of a political force. And so sort of my very brief take-home message, what does the literature tell us to do? It says move towards a power navigator strategy and embrace a theory of change that places power and politics at its center. And I know that can be a really bitter pill to swallow, particularly as academics. So I wanted to know, have we swallowed it? And if so, how does it taste? And so I talked to colleagues. More precisely, I designed a narrative inquiry study, and I talked to 17 active academic activists in Canada, the UK, and the US. My sampling was purposive and chain referral because it's actually a really hard population to identify and to reach. And then the data analysis was within a descriptive interpretation framework and using thematic analysis. I know this is very basic. Happy to answer any questions if you have them. So who was in my sample? I made sort of an intentional effort to have at least 2 representatives of each of the archetypes, which I managed to do. That's the bubble in the middle. And then I also wanted to make sure I had different disciplinary backgrounds, if possible, sort of a diversity in terms of gender and ethnicity. I wanted to make sure I had a majority of people who really had an affiliation or an appointment with the university, because that creates a certain dilemma possibly for this work. And then I ended up with most people in Canada because of the chain referral sampling. That's just something to know. And so what did I find? I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just wanted you to see that what they shared with me, I sort of put into this thematic map, which is sort of a logic representation of their journeys as academic activists. And for most of them, or for all of them at the beginning, there's sort of a call to action, right? There's this intrinsic motivation or the sense of responsibility to have to do something. And then that sort of is filtered through a set of what I call mediators. So things like their identity, their social standing in the academy, but also, value and belief systems that then sort of almost determine which strategic archetype they will choose for themselves. And then other factors like how does the theory of change come to be, what role is the reflections on efficacy play, and of course also the challenges and opportunities. And so I wanted to focus on this theme, what are the gaps in the strategic capacity and why do these gaps persist? And I think that really lives down here and sort of like where do these theories of change and how are they implemented? And so what I found was among these participants, they actually had really great sophistication in terms of how they used tools. So a lot of them had communication training, they had media training, they were fantastic artists in creating infographics, they had written policy briefs, and particularly tools of communication. people were amazing with. What most of them lacked was an intentional strategic integration. So that means they would do, they would have a formerly Twitter account, maybe not even an X account anymore, but, they would sort of like do that, or write op-eds, or sit on certain panels. But sort of this idea of like, why am I doing this beyond I need to share the information and I need to make sure the information gets to the right audience. There wasn't much beyond that theory of change. And so I was wondering why that is. And interestingly, only 4 of my participants had ever even looked at any kind of literature about political change making. And 2 of them actually said, well, I did it sort of in hindsight to justify what I was doing, to find evidence that what I was doing was okay. So it's very intuitive. And then, like I already said, sort of this adherence to simplistic theories of change, like that, the whole almost way the academy works is we create knowledge, we create evidence, because we think this knowledge is missing. And so we want to put that into action. And that is what a lot of people will hold on to. And there's truth to that, but I think it has limits. And then this is also shaped by one's identity and values. And what I mean by that is mostly, do I as an academic identify as an activist, or do I think those are 2 separate things? And do I think that I should be an activist, or I'm allowed to be an activist? So just as an example, most people who will say, that is like not okay for me to do that during my work time as a professor. I don't want to call myself an activist. They usually tend to be more in the truth teller strategic umbrella. And, this may be shaped by some norms in the academy, but I don't really know. Like that's sort of where the data is like, could be, could not be. I don't know where it comes from. And then one last bit that people also shared with me was that there's just a lack of training opportunities beyond sort of these standalone tools. So we can do communication trainings. Sometimes we might even have a training on how to talk to policymakers, or how to reach them. How does the political decision-making system formally work? But sort of things that help us think through it beyond that are very rare. And so I think I have one quote of a participant that encapsulates this well. And they said, I've always just kind of gone with my gut feeling about what is an important message at that time. And even though it's often unpopular and often I'm the only one talking about it, I still go with it. So we'll see. I'm endlessly naive about how to make change in the world. Okay, so given that all of this is like sort of like, oh, I don't know if I should be doing that, if I can do that. I wanted to hear from my participants what are the risks, or what are the benefits that you are facing as you're doing this work. So that obviously lives here in my thematic map. And there's really not a big surprise in terms of, the categories of things that people would share with me. So threat to one's well-being, to one's reputation, or career disadvantages. The surprise was a little bit in the severity of these things. In terms of my participants' words would be, it's actually not that bad. It's a lot less bad than what we anticipated or what we often think. So career disadvantages come in the sense of, missing out on merit pay in a year because they spent too much time on talking to the media and couldn't publish as much. Threat to one's well-being would be, getting threats, but having a very supportive environment that sort of felt protective of that. And threat to one's reputation was actually something that none of my participants had experienced themselves, but they would talk about other people where they would witness it. And benefits, a lot of people would say, there's great reciprocity between my activism and my research. My research has gotten much better because I have these relationships through my activism. 2 people actually said they would get more grants when they write in their sort of activism activities. People would develop friendships, and everybody agreed that it's fulfilling, creates hope and satisfaction. And so sort of the net message there was people said, it doesn't really matter what's been happening to me, I do it anyways, which I thought was a really interesting finding. So again, the field repercussions might not be as ubiquitous as we might think. It might depend on your field and discipline. And the risk might be more significant for racialized or otherwise marginalized scholars. I don't have a big enough sample to sort of claim that, but from the individual experiences, there's definitely a tendency. And of course, for more confrontational activities, for someone who engages in civil disobedience, I have a participant who had been arrested. So, you know, that probably doesn't happen to you yet if you're on the IPCC panel. I don't know, Simon. And in the end, people would say, you know, my intrinsic motivation and the benefits that I get from this work sort of trump, pun not intended, the barriers and risks, and I just tend to do it anyways. And here's a bit of a story of, you know, what things can happen. I've gotten nasty anonymous phone calls. I've had anonymous packages mailed to me. It's shocking. Like, we think peer review is tough. The world of politics is mean and no holds barred, and so that's been kind of hard. But people would also say, for me, it's fulfilling. The people who do these things, it's not because we have to, but because it's important, it's meaningful. And so I tried to give you a one-sentence answer to my overarching question. And that would be, learn how to think through and strategically engage with or build power if you can, which may be the case more often than we think. And when you're ready to learn, or if you're ready to learn, I've developed a workshop. So do reach out. I don't have time anymore to go into more detail. I wanted to acknowledge there are certainly limitations to the approach that I've taken, to my interpretations. A lot of it is subjective to me, to my interpretation, to my biases. I still think there are some implications here for us to take away. The need to move to more complex theories of change. We all know that that's the reality, but we don't want to know. But that means we probably need a more supportive environment to engage with this work, and capacity building needs to focus more on strategic thinking. And with that, thank you all, particularly my committee, community, funders, everyone. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So that's definitely something we all know, and that my participants confirmed, like the incentive system in academia is not at all conducive to this work. It varies a bit between fields and disciplines. And some of my participants have very intentionally chosen certain departments where they know the culture is more supportive. And so it's like in their micro world, they are very free to do this work. Even the person who had done civil disobedience, like they were very supported by their department. They even had, like, you know, fundraiser for when they went to court, and like, so that can happen. Do I think the university has a responsibility? I mean, that's very subjective, but I will say yes. The question how to go about that. It's, you know, it's the good old question of how do we change a whole system from within. I think the more people are leaning into this work, it becomes more normal, becomes more accepted. You know, if there were more resources and time of giving people, in terms of giving people time, more funding to do this kind of work, like some of the tri-council agencies are starting to give knowledge translation grants and so on, but it's all still very much in its infancy. I'm afraid the answer right now is we've got to do it anyways. And the more people do it, maybe the better it will become, it will be received. Hi.
Okay, Pete. Can you tell us a little bit about that workshop?
Yes, I would be happy to, Kai. So the idea of the workshop is to fill that gap of, getting people to think more strategically, getting people to think beyond that theory of change of I just need to make sure I communicate my research better. And as such, I don't tell people what you need to do, and they can come. I've given this workshop 3 times now, and they usually come with their own sort of projects in their own context. And then we go through these 8 steps, and I help them to think through that project with a different perspective. And so it's really only the first step that I give a bit of input of so this is what the literature says, and this is what we see sort of outside of academia. And then we really go down, okay, what is your actual strategic target? And then you have to think about within that, who has the power to create the change? And then what is it that they want? And how can I turn what I have into what they want? And so that's basically what we go through. And then hopefully in step 5, they start to develop a theory of change that goes beyond, evidence-based policy making works. And that's why I need to give the evidence. And in my experience, it's very, very hard for academics to get to that point. Interestingly, I've done this once with a nonprofit organization. They were like, yep, got it. And it took me a whole day of workshop for one of my colleagues to actually say, you know what, I'm starting to realize maybe the skill set I have as a researcher has nothing to do with what I need to do this work. And I was like, bingo. So that's sort of the approach to the workshop. And you can see that choosing your tactics and tools is only step 6. We don't start with that. And that's why I also say I don't tell them you need to do this and this, but we really understand the context and sort of what are the power dynamics there, and then you get to develop your tactics and tools for that particular issue. Thanks for that question. Josephine. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think maybe there's a 2-part answer to that. The terms are very intentional in that I grappled with it a lot. They would attest to that. We had different terms, and there's also the, telling truth to power, which at a certain that used. But I think what we need to understand that the reality lives more in the power dynamics, particularly in the current environment. And so truth, as we can also see playing out in front of our eyes, doesn't really matter that much anymore. And I'm not saying that we need to bow to that reality and leave all truth aside. The point is you still want that evidence that you've created to create the action at the end, but the methods of getting it there need to be different. I think that's sort of how I think about it. Does that answer the question? I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the questions. The question was, okay, what? Yes. Thank you.
And now at a workshop like this, I fear that a lot of academics might have their mental effect or be co-opted by people that they don't want to use it. So I feel like people tend to prefer to stay in that space. Have their messaging or
So the question is, what do you say to people but are afraid that what they're saying might be distorted, and to get just don't have the experience to handle that? I think from experience, my and what participants would share with me as well, the recommendation would be start out doing it with someone who's done it before. And that not only gives you sort of the experience of the person, but also a bit of protection, because people who have done it before usually have access. They often are people who are more secure in their position at the university, who have a certain reputation. And that sort of, as a real novice, that will give you some protection for sure. And the other thing is, like, do it with a bunch of people, right? I have one person who's, very active in terms of like behind the doors meeting with decision makers, policy makers. They said they will never go by themselves. They always have another person. They always have a, if not a recording, a sort of transcript from memory of the meeting, just to sort of have that